Tell us, Ms. Crockett, what experience do you actually bring here? The words rolled off Mitt Romney's tongue with the ease of a man who had never been told no. He leaned back ever so slightly in his chair, his voice dipped in polished condescension, every syllable sharpened not for inquiry, but for dismissal. Around him, the chamber seemed to exhale, half of the room waiting for Jasmine Crockett to stumble, the other half bracing for the familiar sting of arrogance cloaked as civility. But Crockett didn't stumble. She didn't rush to defend herself, didn't scramble to stack up her resume against the weight of privilege that dripped from Romney's question. Instead, she held his gaze. Her lips pressed into a measured line, her chin tilted ever so slightly upward, her silence cutting sharper than any prepared retort could. And in that pause, 5 seconds, maybe less, the entire room shifted. Conversation stilled. The murmurs died. The air itself grew heavy, as though everyone present suddenly recognized they weren't just witnessing a political exchange, but a collision of worlds. The entitled presumption of an old guard and the quiet resilience of a new voice refusing to bow. For Romney, the silence stretched uncomfortably, exposing the hollowness beneath his question. His smirk faltered, his composure cracked, if only slightly. But for Crockett, those seconds became a stage. Her silence wasn't empty, it was a declaration. Louder than any speech. I don't owe you validation. Viewers watching later would replay the clip, astonished not at what was said, but at what wasn't. Comment threads lit up. That silence spoke volumes. She didn't even need words. Her power was in her restraint. What some expected to be a moment of weakness transformed into a masterclass in dignity. Because sometimes, in the theater of politics, the sharpest blade is not the shouted comeback, but the refusal to dignify arrogance at all. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett revealed something profound without opening her mouth. She didn't need Romney's approval, and she didn't need to play his game. But the question lingered in the minds of everyone watching. If silence could shake him, what would happen when she finally chose to speak? The silence lingered, but the story did not end there. What unfolded in that chamber was bigger than a single exchange. It wasn't just about one senator lobbing a patronizing question, or one representative refusing to take the bait. It was about the deeper fault lines of American politics, class, identity, power, and the struggle to be seen as legitimate in a system tilted toward those born into privilege. Mitt Romney didn't simply ask a question. He performed a ritual as old as Washington itself. A man with pedigree, wealth, and dynastic credentials assumed the right to question whether a black woman born without his privileges deserved a seat at the table. His words may have been polished, but the undertone was clear. Are you really qualified to stand next to me? And that is why Crockett's silence burned so brightly. Because it was not silence born of hesitation, it was silence that carried centuries of weight. Generations of women, of immigrants, of working-class families, all dismissed as unworthy by the gatekeepers of power. For them, her refusal to bow, her refusal to scramble for approval, became more than a personal stance. It became a collective act of defiance. The stakes here were not just about Crockett's resume. They were about what America values in its leaders. Do we honor titles and inherited privilege? Or do we respect lived experience, resilience, and the courage to fight for those who don't have the microphone? Romney's question forced that choice into the spotlight, and Crockett, with nothing but composure, turned it back on him. By not speaking, she asked the louder question, "Why do you believe I owe you proof of my worth?" Outside the chamber, the ripples began immediately. Clips circulated with captions that distilled the moment. Entitlement versus experience. Privilege versus resilience. Commentators framed it as a generational and cultural clash, an old guard of politics that demands obedience versus a new wave that commands respect on its own terms. Every retweet, every share carried the same undertone. This wasn't just a back and forth, it was symbolic. Romney represented an America afraid of losing its monopoly on legitimacy. Crockett embodied an America tired of begging for recognition. And yet, as powerful as that silence was, it was only the beginning. Because what many didn't realize in that instant was that Crockett's restraint wasn't weakness. It was strategy. She was holding back, biding her time, letting Romney expose himself. And when the moment came for her to unleash her response, it would not just answer his question, it would dismantle the premise of it altogether. But before we get there, the contrast had to be understood. To fully grasp why Crockett's silence felt so seismic, you had to understand the man who tried to dismiss her. Because Romney's story is not simply his own, it's the blueprint of privilege masquerading as merit. And as his backstory unfolds, the stakes grow clearer. This wasn't just Mitt Romney versus Jasmine Crockett. It was the old America questioning the new, and the answer would shake far beyond the walls of that chamber. To understand why Mitt Romney's words carried such an air of entitlement, you have to look at the man himself, the polished mask, the carefully crafted image, and the privileged pathway that brought him here. Romney is no stranger to power. Born into it, raised in its glow, he walked through doors most Americans never even see. His father, George Romney, was governor of Michigan, a corporate titan, and a Republican standard-bearer. From the beginning, Mitt's world was one where opportunity wasn't earned so much as expected. Harvard polished him, wealth protected him, and the networks of high society paved his ascent. In boardrooms and on campaign trails, Romney perfected the art of speaking with authority, of sounding like a man who had the answers. But behind the cultivated civility lurked a hollowness, a conviction that titles and privilege conferred legitimacy, not lived struggle. It is the quiet arrogance of someone who has rarely been forced to justify his place in the room. That arrogance was on full display when he leaned toward Jasmine Crockett. To Romney, asking her to list her experience seemed natural, even necessary. But the question itself betrayed something deeper, an assumption that his own presence was self-explanatory, while hers was a matter of suspicion. He never had to prove he belonged. She, in his eyes, had to audition. Romney's career has long embodied this contradiction. On one hand, he has styled himself as the reasonable Republican, a man above the populist fray, someone who could be a moral compass in a party veering off course. On the other hand, his record reveals a knack for political survival that often bends to convenience. When expedient, he's the polished moderate. When necessary, he plays the partisan loyalist, but the mask has slipped before. In 2012, his infamous 47% comment revealed the disdain beneath the smile, an outlook that divided America into the worthy and the dependent, the givers and the takers. That moment cost him the presidency, but it didn't cost him his confidence. He remained in his own mind the embodiment of merit. And so when he faced Jasmine Crockett, the subtext of his question wasn't curiosity, it was challenge. It was a test born of entitlement. Prove yourself to me, the man whose lineage and resume speak for themselves. It was the old America demanding deference from the new. But here's the problem for Romney. The country has changed. The old script doesn't land the same way anymore. Viewers who once might have nodded along with him now saw something else. An establishment figure trying to diminish someone whose path had been infinitely harder, whose every achievement had been earned without the safety net of privilege. The very posture that once secured Romney's power now betrayed him. His tone came across not as authority but as arrogance. His words didn't sound like reason, but like dismissal. And Crockett, with her silence, exposed that contradiction in an instant. Because here is the truth about Romney. For all his polished speeches, his pedigree, his carefully managed reputation, he represents a fading archetype. He is the embodiment of an era where leadership was defined by wealth, race, and inherited access. And the exchange with Crockett was not just another debate moment. It was a mirror held up to that archetype, a reminder that legitimacy is no longer granted by pedigree, but demanded by authenticity. Romney may not have realized it then, but his question revealed more about him than it did about Crockett. It revealed the insecurity of a man who has lived in the comfort of power, watching the ground shift beneath him. His challenge wasn't about her. It was about clinging to a sense of superiority that the new generation no longer recognizes, and that's why this confrontation mattered. Because Crockett wasn't just responding to Romney the man, she was responding to everything he represented. The silence wasn't simply a rebuke. It was an unveiling. It stripped Romney's privilege bare, leaving the audience to see the hollowness behind the polished mask. But to truly understand why her silence struck with such force, you need to know who Jasmine Crockett is. Because her story is not one of inherited advantage or gilded pathways. It is a story of grit, of struggle, of climbing uphill in a world that wasn't built for her to succeed. And when that story collided with Romney's entitlement, the contrast became undeniable. What Romney embodied with pedigree and privilege, Crockett embodied with perseverance and pain. And when she refused to dignify his question with an answer, she didn't just protect her own dignity. She carried the weight of everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, and that is why her silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, it was layered, it was earned. It was the answer Romney didn't see coming. But who is Jasmine Crockett? And why did her journey make that silence thunder so loudly across America? To understand why Jasmine Crockett's silence reverberated like thunder, you must first understand the woman behind it. Hers is not the story of gilded halls and inherited names. It is the story of a fighter who climbed every rung with her own hands, often while the weight of the world tried to drag her down. Crockett was not born into power. She was born into a world that demanded she prove herself twice over, once as a woman and again as a black woman. While others had their paths smoothed by wealth or lineage, her road was marked by obstacles. Each step forward was a negotiation with systems designed to keep her at the margins. And yet she walked it anyway. She built her life on service. Before politics, she was an attorney, standing shoulder to shoulder with the voiceless, often defending those who had nothing but the truth on their side. In courtrooms across Texas, she learned to hold her ground against men who believed they owned the space, who mistook arrogance for authority. She learned that justice doesn't always arrive in speeches, but sometimes in the courage to simply stand firm, even in silence. Her background isn't the tidy narrative of privilege. It is textured with sacrifice, late nights spent studying, days spent battling systemic injustice, years spent earning every ounce of credibility through sweat, intellect, and resolve. Unlike Romney, she didn't have doors flung open to her. She had to break them down. But Crockett's rise is not just about hardship. It's about the fire that hardship forged. It's about the resilience that came from being underestimated at every turn, from being told, "You don't belong here," and deciding again and again to prove otherwise. Every slight, every dismissal, every battle etched into her character the kind of dignity that cannot be bought, only built. And that is what Romney failed to see. When he asked her to list her experience, he imagined a resume contest. But Crockett's qualifications aren't bullet points on a sheet of paper. They are lived battles, scars, and victories that taught her how to endure. Her silence in that chamber carried the echoes of those experiences. The courtroom where she defended the marginalized. The community meetings where she listened instead of dictating. The countless nights where she prepared not just to participate in democracy, but to change it. To her supporters, Crockett isn't just another politician. She is proof that representation matters, that leadership can come from those who weren't groomed in country clubs or Ivy League enclaves. She speaks with the cadence of authenticity, the kind that cannot be rehearsed, because it comes from surviving the very inequities she now seeks to dismantle. That is why her silence struck so deeply. It wasn't empty space. It was the weight of her journey pressing down on a single moment. She didn't need to rattle off accomplishments. Her very presence in that chamber was an accomplishment. Her silence said, "I am here despite everything. I do not need to justify myself to you." And yet Crockett's silence was not defiance for defiance's sake. It was strategy, rooted in wisdom earned the hard way. She knew that sometimes speaking fuels arrogance while silence exposes it. She knew that in a world where people like Romney are given the presumption of competence and people like her are forced to prove it, refusing to play the game is itself a radical act. Viewers saw it. They felt it. The silence reminded them of their own battles, of interviews where they were asked to prove themselves unfairly, of classrooms where they were underestimated, of boardrooms where their voices were dismissed. Crockett wasn't just silent for herself. She was silent for everyone who had ever felt the sting of being told they weren't enough. And that silence became more than a pause. It became a declaration, a living testimony to the dignity of those who refuse to shrink. It was a reminder that legitimacy doesn't come from titles or wealth. It comes from courage, from resilience, from authenticity. Romney could not have known that his question would create such a moment. To him, it was another chance to reinforce hierarchy. To Crockett, it was another chance to shatter it. And with nothing but her presence, she did. But silence is only part of the story. For while that moment shook the chamber, it also set the stage for what was to come, because Romney's arrogance would not stop there. The exchange escalated, tensions mounted, and the room would soon witness something even more dramatic. Crockett's resolve tested under the weight of direct confrontation. Her silence had rattled him. But what would happen when the debate truly escalated? When words had to be spoken? When composure would meet hostility head-on? That is where the real drama began. The silence should have ended it. For a moment it seemed as if Romney had been exposed by nothing more than Crockett's refusal to play along. But arrogance rarely retreats so easily. Instead, it doubles down, masking its unease with more words, more posturing, more attempts to reassert control. And that is exactly what Romney did. He leaned forward again. This time his tone sharpened, his voice a fraction louder, as if sheer persistence could undo the sting of that silence. He repeated his question, layering it with phrases meant to sound authoritative, but dripping with condescension. The American people deserve to know what qualifies you. Don't you think it's fair to answer? The room stirred. Crockett did not flinch. She shifted in her seat, her expression composed, her body language calm but unyielding. Every movement of hers contrasted Romney's agitation. He looked like a man scrambling to regain control. She looked like a woman who had never lost it. Spectators felt the tension climbing. The chamber seemed to buzz with unspoken commentary. Some on Romney's side smirked, expecting Crockett to crack under the pressure, expecting her to defend herself with nervous words. Others leaned in, sensing that she was about to turn the tide. The energy was thick, cinematic, the kind of moment where everyone present knows history is unfolding in real time. Romney's persistence only highlighted his insecurity. Every repeated demand sounded less like a senator exercising oversight and more like a man unsettled by a refusal to bend. His voice carried entitlement, but his eyes betrayed frustration. For years, people answered him without hesitation. Crockett's composure unsettled that pattern, and he didn't know how to handle it. Crockett, meanwhile, continued to wield silence like a blade. When she finally did move to speak, she didn't rush, she didn't stumble. She inhaled slowly, adjusted her microphone, and let the pause linger a moment longer. Her restraint was calculated, each beat forcing the room to hang on her next move. And then she spoke, not to defend her resume, not to indulge Romney's demand, but to reframe the entire exchange. She began with calm precision, her voice steady, her tone measured. Senator, my experience is not a question. It is a record. It's the courtroom where I defended the poor. It's the communities I've served when no one else was listening. It's standing here today despite every attempt to suggest I don't belong. The chamber rippled. Some heads nodded. A few gasps slipped out. Crockett's words weren't long-winded, but they cut deep. By refusing to rattle off a sterile list of accomplishments, she had transformed Romney's question into a revelation of his own bias. He had asked for justification. She gave him truth, but even that wasn't the breaking point. Because Crockett didn't stop there, she let the silence return, hanging over her words like punctuation. And in that pause, Romney's face tightened. The smirk was gone. The certainty had cracked. He tried again, interjecting, pushing back with the same smug insistence. Yet the more he pressed, the weaker his authority sounded. The escalation had reached its peak. One man raising his voice, trying to force submission, while one woman calmly held her ground, refusing to surrender her dignity. It was a visual, visceral clash. Privilege versus perseverance. Arrogance versus authenticity. Observers described the energy like static electricity. You could feel the imbalance in the room, the sense that Romney was unraveling while Crockett was only growing stronger. Her silence had been powerful, but her poised words, delivered sparingly and deliberately, turned the tables. She was no longer defending herself. She was indicting the very culture that allowed questions like his to be asked at all. And as the chamber held its breath once more, the audience knew they were on the edge of something extraordinary. Because what came next would not just be a defense. It would be a counterattack, a moment where Crockett would seize the narrative entirely, delivering the kind of blow that no headline could ignore. Her silence had shaken him. Her words had steadied her. But the real mic drop, the moment that would leave Romney reeling and the country buzzing, was still to come. It began with silence, but it did not end there. After enduring Romney's layered condescension, after refusing to flinch at his demands, Jasmine Crockett chose her moment. And when she finally struck, it was not with anger, not with volume, but with precision so sharp it cut through the chamber like glass, breaking in a cathedral. She leaned forward just slightly, not enough to look rattled, just enough to claim the microphone as her own. Her voice was calm, almost disarmingly so. "Senator," she began, the word carrying both acknowledgement and quiet dismissal, "my record is not up for debate. It exists, it is lived, and no amount of questions designed to minimize me can erase that." The words landed heavy. It wasn't a laundry list. It wasn't a resume recital. It was a mirror. She turned Romney's question back on him, making it clear that the burden was not hers to justify, but his to explain why he thought she needed to. The chamber stirred. Some gasped quietly, others smiled in recognition of what had just happened. Crockett hadn't raised her voice, but she had raised the stakes. Romney had expected a defensive scramble. Instead, he got composure laced with accusation. Romney tried to interrupt. He adjusted his posture, shifted in his seat, the practiced ease of his smile, faltering as he muttered about the seriousness of the office and the people's right to know. But the interruptions betrayed him. They sounded less like authority and more like desperation. He was a man trying to reassert control that had already slipped away. Crockett let him finish. And then, without hesitation, she leaned in once more. "You asked me what experience I bring here. Let me tell you, the experience of knowing what it means to be doubted at every step. The experience of standing up for people who never get asked about their qualifications, because no one assumes they have any to begin with. The experience of surviving in a system that was not built for me and still managing to make it here." The chamber erupted with murmurs, the kind that signal history in the making. She wasn't listing degrees or titles. She was narrating a lived reality, one that millions watching across America recognized as their own. And in doing so, she exposed Romney's question for what it truly was, not a measure of merit, but a weapon of dismissal. Her tone never wavered. She didn't shout, didn't falter, didn't let anger cloud the delivery. She wielded restraint as her weapon, letting the weight of her words do the work. Silence framed each sentence, forcing the room to sit with them, to feel their gravity. Romney shifted again. His smirk had vanished completely. His eyes darted briefly, scanning the room as if searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. For once, he wasn't the center of control. He was the subject of exposure. The more he tried to reassert himself, the smaller he seemed against the backdrop of Crockett's dignity. The silence returned, strategically, after her final words. She let it sit, let it breathe, let the cameras capture Romney in the uncomfortable stillness of being dismantled without a raised voice. That silence once again spoke louder than any rebuttal he could have offered. Social media later slowed that clip down, playing it on loop. The silence, his uneasy shift, her calm expression. Commenters called it the most devastating mic drop without a microphone. Others wrote, "She didn't just answer him. She ended him." What made it so powerful was that Crockett never gave Romney the spectacle he wanted. He expected a clash, a defensive tirade he could dismiss as emotional or unprofessional. Instead, she gave him composure. Instead, she let his arrogance indict itself. Instead, she reminded the chamber that sometimes the most powerful counterattack is not volume, but dignity, and the impact went beyond Romney. Because in that moment, Crockett wasn't just speaking to him. She was speaking to every American who had ever been told to prove themselves while watching others glide through unchallenged. Her silence and her words combined into a lesson. Legitimacy does not require permission, and dignity does not beg for approval. The cameras captured it all. The flicker in Romney's eyes, the faint tension in his jaw, the way his composure collapsed in the face of Crockett's calm. It was a visual metaphor for the larger truth unfolding in American politics. The old ways of dismissing and diminishing were no longer working. When the session adjourned, Romney walked out with the stiffness of a man who had lost ground he didn't know could be lost. Crockett, by contrast, walked out with the quiet assurance of someone who had nothing left to prove. She hadn't raised her voice, but she had raised the conversation. She hadn't shouted down arrogance. She had exposed it, and in the hours that followed, the aftershocks began. Clips flooded Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. Hashtags sprang to life. Crockett silence. An experience that matters. Romney exposed. Within hours, the silence had become a movement. The mic drop without words, a rallying cry. But even as the internet caught fire, the real impact was only beginning. Because this wasn't just a viral clip, it was a cultural moment. And like all cultural moments, it didn't stop at the chamber door. It spilled into living rooms, classrooms, workplaces, and communities across America. The silence had spoken. The counterattack had landed. But the shockwaves, the reverberations that would ripple across media, politics, and public imagination, were still to come. The moment didn't stay confined within the marble walls of the chamber. By the time Jasmine Crockett walked out of the hearing, the footage was already ricocheting across the digital landscape. Newsrooms clipped the exchange within minutes. Social media influencers snatched the silence, slowed it down, and looped Romney's uneasy fidget against Crockett's unwavering composure. By the time evening fell, America had its newest viral moment, and it wasn't Romney holding the spotlight. Cable news anchors scrambled to frame the story. On progressive outlets, the headline read like a victory chant: Crockett schools Romney with silence. Analysts leaned in, replaying the exact 5-second pause, dissecting every flicker of body language. This wasn't just political theater, one commentator declared. This was a masterclass in power dynamics. Crockett didn't have to shout. She let silence do the talking. On conservative networks, the spin was swift but strained. They tried to paint Crockett as evasive, suggesting her refusal to list her resume was a sign of weakness. But the clips told another story. Every replay only highlighted Romney's overreach, his smirk fading as he pressed a question that no longer looked authoritative. It looked petty. The more they tried to frame Crockett as dodging, the more the public saw her as dismantling. Online, the reaction was electric. Hashtags surged: Crockett silence, Mick drop moment, Romney exposed. Memes sprouted overnight. Romney frozen mid-smirk captioned with, "This you?" alongside Crockett's steady gaze captioned with, "Say less." TikTok creators remixed the clip into everything from rap beats to dramatic reenactments. One viral edit placed the silence over a cinematic soundtrack, swelling strings under Crockett's calm expression, while the camera caught Romney shrinking in real time. Millions watched, shared, and commented, "This is how you handle arrogance." But the impact wasn't just comedic or viral. It was deeply emotional. In comment sections and quote tweets, people from marginalized backgrounds poured out their stories. "This is every job interview I've ever had," one user wrote. Another said, watching her not flinch, "It felt like she was standing for all of us who've had to prove ourselves twice over." Crockett's silence became more than a tactic. It became a symbol. Journalists took notice of that resonance. Long-form articles appeared within 24 hours, not just about the clash itself, but about what it represented. The Washington Post ran a headline: "When silence speaks louder than a resume, Jasmine Crockett's viral moment and the politics of belonging." The New York Times framed it as a generational divide. Old guard questions, new guard answers. Think pieces poured in about gender, race, and power. How the expectation to prove yourself never lands evenly, and how Crockett had flipped that expectation on its head. Romney's allies tried damage control. Spokespeople issued statements claiming the senator was merely asking a fair question about qualifications. But the internet wasn't buying it. Every press release looked weaker against the raw, unedited footage looping online. And worse for Romney, late-night hosts joined in. Trevor Noah, Stephen Colbert, and others ran segments replaying the silence, roasting Romney's fidgeting as the universal look of a man losing an argument he thought he'd already won. Laughter sealed the verdict. Meanwhile, Crockett didn't gloat. When approached by reporters, she simply said, "I'm here to do the work. My record speaks for itself." It was humility wrapped in confidence, the perfect foil to Romney's overcompensation. That humility fueled the narrative. She hadn't sought the spotlight, but she owned it when it came. By day 3, the story had shifted from what happened to what it meant. Editorial boards weighed in, calling the moment a cultural reset. Civil rights leaders praised Crockett for modeling strength without apology. Young activists blasted out the clip as proof that the future of politics belonged not to those who demanded deference, but to those who redefined it. In immigrant communities, the moment hit particularly deep. Ethnic media outlets translated the exchange, replaying it on radio shows and community news channels. Commentators in Spanish, Urdu, Mandarin, and Arabic described Crockett's silence as a familiar act of survival, the refusal to bow when power tries to belittle. Listeners called in, many in tears, saying they saw their parents, their struggles, their resilience in her posture. The ripple effect grew. Professors assigned the clip in communications classes as an example of rhetorical strategy. Activists played it at rallies as inspiration. Even corporate diversity trainers cited it, framing it as a lesson in how to confront bias without surrendering dignity. Romney, once thought untouchable by virtue of seniority and reputation, suddenly looked diminished. He became a meme, a punchline, a cautionary tale about the perils of underestimating those you seek to patronize. Crockett, on the other hand, became the name on everyone's lips. Her fundraising spiked. Volunteers flooded her office with offers to join her movement. She was invited onto primetime shows, where hosts asked her not just about Romney, but about the future she represented. Each appearance deepened the impression. She wasn't just a fighter, she was a figure of change. But the true triumph lay not in the headlines or the hashtags. It was in the quiet conversations happening across the country. Families watching together said, "That's how you stand up." Teachers showed students how silence could be power. Workers replayed the clip before walking into their own meetings, drawing strength from Crockett's composure. In those ways, the impact outgrew the moment. Crockett's silence became a vocabulary for dignity, a shorthand for refusing to be diminished. And Romney's question, once designed to cut her down, had instead elevated her into something larger than a senator sparring in a chamber. She had become a symbol of endurance, of refusal, of belonging. The story didn't end with the viral wave. It was only the beginning, because every viral moment has a second act, what it transforms into once the spotlight dims. And for Jasmine Crockett, the silence that shook one chamber was about to reverberate far beyond it, into a movement, into a legacy, into the story of how dignity redefines power. At the heart of this clash lay more than a question about qualifications. It was a confrontation between two worldviews, one clinging to the belief that power entitles you to interrogate, diminish, and belittle, and another rooted in the conviction that true authority comes from service, resilience, and the courage to belong unapologetically. Romney's words were meant to remind Jasmine Crockett of her place, to pull her back into the hierarchy he thought unshakable. But her silence, followed by her precise, measured response, did something more profound. It revealed the crumbling foundation beneath that hierarchy. It showed that deference to arrogance is no longer inevitable. In that moment, Crockett gave the country more than a viral clip. She delivered a lesson in dignity, one that transcended politics and resonated on a human level. Dignity, she proved, doesn't shout. It doesn't flail. It doesn't need to rattle off bullet points to be valid. Dignity stands steady and unbending until arrogance folds under its own weight. This is why the silence mattered. Because in a culture obsessed with noise, debates filled with interruptions, social media drowning in insults, headlines competing for shock, Crockett reminded us of an ancient truth, that silence can carry more power than any shouted word. For every immigrant who has ever sat in an interview knowing they'd have to prove twice as much, for every woman who has been asked to justify her seat at the table, for every young person told they are not ready, Crockett's silence was a gift, a mirror, a rallying cry. Romney's mistake was assuming that qualifications are something one must recite to be believed. Crockett's brilliance was demonstrating that qualifications are lived, not listed. They are etched into every case fought, every community defended, every barrier pushed through. They are embodied, not itemized. And so, the moral of this story stretched far beyond Capitol Hill. It was a reminder to every viewer, every listener, every citizen, that the power to define your worth does not rest in the hands of those who question you. It rests in the way you carry yourself in the face of those questions. It rests in the refusal to let arrogance set the terms of your belonging. Crockett showed that you do not win by playing the game on your opponent's board. You win by flipping the board entirely, by showing that the question itself is flawed. And in doing so, she did what every hero of dignity has done across history. She turned an attack into a revelation, an insult into an anthem. The lesson is clear. In politics, in workplaces, in families, in classrooms, wherever power seeks to diminish, the choice remains the same: to bow, to argue endlessly, or to stand, calm and resolute. Crockett chose the last, and in doing so, she handed the nation a blueprint for dignity in the face of doubt. As the dust settled, one truth rang out above the noise. Romney had tried to test Crockett's legitimacy. Instead, Crockett tested America's conscience. And America, at least those watching with open eyes, understood. Her silence was not emptiness. It was declaration, a declaration that said, I belong. I am enough. I will not justify my existence to satisfy your doubt. And in a time where so many still feel unseen, unheard, or underestimated, that declaration became more than personal. It became universal. It became a reminder that dignity is not just a tactic, it is a destiny. But even moral lessons need a final note, a moment to tie back to the very spark that ignited them. And so the story turned toward its closing frame, not an ending but a call. Because Crockett's silence did not conclude the conversation. It began one, and the real question left lingering was this: what will we do with the lesson she gave us? And so we returned to where it all began, one senator's question, asked with the smug certainty of someone who believed he held the upper hand. What exactly makes you qualified? Romney pressed, expecting submission, expecting Crockett to bend under the weight of doubt. Instead, history will remember something else. Not his question, not his posture, but her silence. That pause, 5 seconds that felt like an eternity, spoke louder than any list of credentials ever could. It was the silence of defiance, the silence of dignity, the silence of someone who knew her worth required no permission slip. That is why this moment matters. Because it wasn't just about Jasmine Crockett versus Mitt Romney. It was about every single person who has ever been underestimated, overlooked, or forced to prove themselves again and again. It was about the power of standing firm when others try to shrink you. And if there is one truth this story leaves us with, it's this: dignity doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to beg, it stands. And in standing, it wins. Now it's our turn. If Crockett's silence gave you goosebumps, if it reminded you of your own battles for respect, then let this channel be your space. Subscribe, share this video, and join a community that believes in dignity over arrogance, service over entitlement, truth over theater. Because these stories are not just entertainment, they are fuel. They remind us who we are and who we refuse to be. In the end, Romney's question may have tried to diminish, but Crockett's silence defined. And long after the noise fades, that definition will remain. History doesn't always speak in words. Sometimes it speaks in silence, and this silence will echo for years.